Jeopardy has always stood out to me amongst every other game show that I've ever seen. Not only does it require you to have a ton of different knowledge, especially at the Tournament of Champions level, but also, as long as you keep on winning, there is nothing to say that you couldn't stay on Jeopardy until the very day it ends. Because unlike any other game show that I know of, there is no limit to how many games you can win in a row.
Now they can win as many games as their talents will allow. And that could mean perhaps champions leaving us with $250,000 or $500,000. Who knows?
Which naturally has led to some incredibly strong champions emerging throughout the history of this show. And of course, it wouldn't be a video about the best Jeopardy players of all time without including the GOAT himself, Ken Jennings. If you're a fan of this show at all, Ken is a man who needs no introduction, because not only is he the greatest player of all time, but he has also been hosting the show for several years now as well, replacing the late great Alex Trebek.
Don't want to miss a moment of Jeopardy? Hit the subscribe button below.
And more than 20 years ago, Ken would make his very first appearance on the show as a contestant. The date was June 4th, 2004, where Ken would face off against a woman named Julia Lazarus, sitting to the right of him, along with the returning champion, Jerry Harvey, who wasn't exactly weak himself, having managed to win $70,000 in just 2 games, so it was fair to say that Ken was going to have his work cut out for him. And of course we all know how this story goes, but what you might not realize is just how close this game actually was. In the very early game, Jerry and Ken were going back and forth, with a slight lead for Ken, but then Jerry actually pulled the first daily double, went for a true daily double, which means betting all your money if you didn't know. And well, he got it wrong. And right after that, Julia actually got her first answer in, which was a $1,000 question, along with her managing to snag a second one right before the end of Single Jeopardy, leaving her at $2,000 even, Ken with a relatively dominant $4,600, and Jerry currently not on the board. Also, if you've ever been curious, on his very first appearance, Ken had a few people that he actually wanted to thank, and I think you will all really get a kick out of this.
Big Jeopardy watchers, but I'd like to thank Fuzzy the truck driver and the 2 drunk teenagers because they were the ones who gave me a ride when I was stranded in the middle of the Nevada desert a few years ago. So,
Are you implying that drunk teenagers and truck drivers are not likely to be Jeopardy fans? Is that what you're telling this national audience?
I'm sure they're your biggest demographic.
But as far as the rest of Single Jeopardy goes, our 3 contestants came out of it looking pretty similar to before, in that Ken was a strong first place, with Julia still maintaining a strong lead over Jerry. Now in Double Jeopardy, Ken would get the first daily double, and with a very solid lead. He only bet $2,000, but easily got it right, putting him over double of Julia's total now. So now you're thinking, when was it this game ever close? Well, just a few questions later, Julia got the other daily double, betting $5,000, and she also easily solved the question, putting her up to $11,000 against Ken's $14K. So now we really have a game. Ken would then go on a good streak of answering, but Julia wasn't ready to give up, answering a few questions of her own. And more importantly, Ken also started getting several wrong within a rapid succession. In the meantime, Jerry picked up a decent score for himself, and by the end of Double Jeopardy, Julia was only $1,400 away from Ken's score of $20,000 even. And then, in Final Jeopardy, things only get even more interesting, as Jerry would come up with the correct answer to Final Jeopardy, which was Marion Jones, but only added a single dollar to his total in the process. And well, Julia would get this question wrong, but the craziest part is that for his answer, Ken simply wrote Jones, and I think it's safe to assume that Ken knew the correct answer. But imagine if the judges had simply decided that he wasn't specific enough, and Ken never went on to be the champion that he is today.
Who is Jones? And we will accept that. In terms of female athletes, there aren't that many.
Well, of course, we don't have to, as not only did Ken win that first game, but another 73 in a row afterwards as well. This means that even today, more than 20 years later, he still has the longest streak in history by a margin of 34 games. But let's not forget, back when Ken accomplished his incredible run, it had been less than 1 year since Jeopardy actually removed its 5-day limit for champions. With the premiere of Season 20 on September 8th of 2003, a new rule was introduced, known as Sky's the Limit, which is pretty self-explanatory. Contestants would no longer be limited to a maximum run of 5 days, and could instead stay on the show until someone defeated them. Essentially like a King of the Hill format.
Sky's the limit.
And once Ken had reached the point where he was a 6-day champion, this is what Alex Trebek had to say.
He will remain champion on the program until he is defeated. That could well be 20 games, could be 30, who knows? Susan and Laura, you know how good you're going to have to be today.
Quite clearly, Alex recognized a GOAT when he saw one, considering that at this point, nobody had even made it past the 7-day mark before.
Thank you, Johnny. Hi, folks, and welcome to our show. We've never had an 8-day champion. Will today be that day? Ken's dressed up. He's wearing a jacket. He's more formal. He's won so much money, he figures he wants to present himself in a better way.
And when I say that Ken is the GOAT, that doesn't come lightly, but rather it's because not only does Ken have, by far, the longest streak in Jeopardy history, but he also managed to defeat 2 other GOAT contenders, James Holzhauer and Brad Rutter, in a relatively recent tournament, showing that regardless of the era, Ken is incredibly knowledgeable, and overall, the greatest Jeopardy player of all time. And just as a fun little side note, I can vividly remember watching this show with my dad while Ken was on, and it got the point where he was wishing for Ken to lose, just to see somebody new as the champion. Let me know if any of you guys can relate to feeling that way yourself, or if you remember having a family member who did as well. And it's honestly taken a really long time for someone to even come close to Ken. But that doesn't mean he stands alone amongst the greatest of all time anymore here in 2025. Ken Jennings may be at the very top, but just barely below him, we have the legendary James Holzhauer, who has honestly accomplished things on this show that Ken simply never will.
Hey, Brad's score's still on there.
Wow.
Most notably, he has all 10 of the highest single game scores ever achieved on the show, and it reached the point in which he purposely won exactly $110,914 in a certain game, as that actually corresponds to the date of his daughter's birthday.
38,314, a new one-day record.
And keep in mind, once you exclude all 12 of James Holzhauer's top scores, you'll finally find Matamodio with a score of 83,000 in a single game. So yeah, needless to say, nobody else has even gotten close to 100K in a single game. Well, James did it 6 different times. And as you may know, he's actually a professional sports gambler as well.
Are we going to see the famous James push?
All in. House limit. All the cheddar. All of the chips, please.
Which may have you thinking that he must have simply gotten lucky on daily doubles and constantly bet double on everything. But here's something crazy. He actually blows Ken Jennings out of the water in a couple different statistics that have nothing to do with luck. First of all, if we take a look at the leaderboard for most correct answers in a single game, we'll find Ken with a strong spot in second place, having managed to get 44 answers correct and only 2 wrong, which is pretty amazing considering that the entire show only had 60 questions to answer between single and double Jeopardy. But here's the crazy part. James has managed to get 44 answers correct in 2 separate games. And here's the kicker. During both of them, he also got 0 incorrect as well. And beyond that, if we scroll down the list, James has another game where he got 43 correct with 0 wrong, another game with 43 right and 1 wrong, and finally we see Ken Jennings again, who along with James having 1 game here, has 2 in which he got 43 correct and 2 answers incorrect. And if this statistic wasn't crazy enough, here is one that simply blew my mind. And I want to give a shout out to the Jeopardy fandom for keeping track of all these different statistics. But according to their leaderboard, James Holzhauer also had 28 games in a row in which he managed to get the final Jeopardy question correct, spanning from the 6th game of his streak all the way to his appearance in the quarterfinals of the Tournament of Champions, which he also won that year. And just for reference, the next closest streak is a tie for second place at just 12 games, while Ken's best was a streak of 10. And of course, those are still quite impressive numbers, given how difficult that some of the Final Jeopardy questions can get. But it just puts into perspective how consistent that James really was. It wasn't just a matter of how electrifying that his bets were.
25-6, please.
Really? All of it on rockers. Here's your clue.
Because we've seen other players put it all on the line, but rather his willingness to do so in addition to an incredible base of knowledge as well. So, needless to say, James had a whole lot more than luck going for him, accomplishing what could arguably be the most incredible run in this show's history, considering that he only made about $58,000 less than Ken Jennings, with a win streak of only 32 games. And I say only, not to call that weak, because it's obviously not. But keep in mind, that's still less than half of the games that Ken won, meaning that James was averaging well over double the winnings that Ken was per game, only making his run even more impressive.
True. We'll be seeing him again, folks. Take care. So long.
And now it's time to discuss a very different kind of champion from the first two, that being Brad Rutter. His Jeopardy resume is quite interesting, because Brad actually made his very first appearance on the show all the way back in the year 2000, on October 30th to be specific. This means that Jeopardy champions were still limited to a maximum of just 5 days, which Brad was able to accomplish. And if he's in this video, you're probably expecting that his wins were insanely dominant. But you can see in his first game here that, while Brad was leading by Final Jeopardy, it was still anyone's game. Of course, we also saw that in Ken's first game when Julia kept things super close by the end. But unlike in that game, both of Brad's opponents actually got the Final Jeopardy question correct.
Harry Powers, you're absolutely right, yes.
So it was all up to Brad to also pull it off, which of course we know he did. And you might be thinking that his final score seems kind of low, and that's because, well, it is. But that's not the fault of Brad at all, but rather the fact that before the year 2001, every question was only worth half as much as it is today on both the single and double Jeopardy rounds. So anyone who was a champion in this era actually has to have their score doubled in order to reflect what the player would have earned while playing today. And with Brad becoming a 5-day champion, he would make it to the 2001 Tournament of Champions.
Look for you in the Tournament of Champions. Congratulations, gentlemen. Good game.
Which paid out $100,000 at the time. And as you might have already guessed, he was able to win this tournament as well, already putting him amongst the Jeopardy greats of his time. But this was only the beginning, as Brad was then invited to the 2002 $1 Million Masters Tournament, where he would face off in the finals against the 1987 Tournament of Champions winner, Bob Verini, and the 1989 Teen Tournament champion, Eric Newhouse, who had also won the 1998 Teen Reunion Tournament just 4 years before this event. This tournament did have some other contestants in the earlier rounds as well, but after the dust had settled, Brad would come out on top, betting exactly enough to beat Eric by a single dollar, mirroring the way that he won his very first game on the show. This made Brad the show's first millionaire before Ken had even seen his first episode. And speaking of Ken, he and Brad would actually get to face off in the finals of the 2005 Ultimate Tournament of Champions, with a staggering grand prize of $2 million. And Brad's streak of never being defeated would only continue as he ended up besting Ken in this event. Now, it is important to note that in 2011, Ken and Brad would both be invited to play against an IBM supercomputer.
Watson.
What is clock?
Clock is correct.
In which case they both lost to it, but Brad specifically wound up in third. Although you can hardly call that a standard match of Jeopardy! And sure enough, in the 2014 Battle of the Decades, Brad would again manage to best Ken Jennings in the finals, taking home another $1 million in the process. As if this wasn't enough, 2019 would see the unique All-Star Games, where teams of 3 were actually formed, and both Brad and Ken were acting as team captains. As you can surely guess by now, both of their teams made it to the finals, where again, Brad would get the victory, alongside his teammates Larissa Kelly and David Madden, with both of them being super champions in their own right. And this brings us back full circle, back to the greatest of all time tournament that was hosted in early 2020, where of course, Brad would be defeated by both Ken Jennings and James Holzhauer. But even today, he has won more money from the show than any other player once you include tournaments. And of course it helps that Brad got to compete for $1 million before Ken even got to be on the show, but he still had to be good enough to even be invited to the $1 Million Masters. And then he had to be good enough to win it as well, competing against the best players the show had ever seen up to that point. And it wouldn't be until he faced a supercomputer that Brad would even lose for the first time. So one can only guess how long he could have stayed on the show if the sky's the limit rule had been implemented just a few years earlier. I'm sure you can probably tell, but this is my first time trying to make a video, so any feedback is highly appreciated. I'm not really sure if this will even find anyone, but if it does, and people seem to enjoy this video, I'll make a follow-up one about the strongest modern-day champions. Players like Matt Amodio, Amy Schneider, and Matea Roach come to mind. In fact, I'm pretty sure they all competed together in what could easily be the most insane Tournament of Champions we've ever had. So yeah, if anyone would want to see content surrounding that, just let me know.